"I'm sorry, Ms. Carter, but we were told you have a criminal record," the recruiter said over the phone, and Emily Carter felt the words settle over the room like cold dust. The apartment was small, barely 600 square feet, with a narrow kitchen that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and laundry detergent. Outside the window, the early spring wind moved through the trees of a quiet Denver street. But inside the room, everything felt still. Emily lowered the phone slowly, staring at the blank wall across from her desk. She was 28 years old, a college graduate who had never even received a speeding ticket. Yet the sentence echoed in her mind as if someone had rewritten her entire life in a single line. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she cleared her throat and tried again, her voice steady but confused. "I think there must be a mistake," she said. "I've never had any kind of criminal charge." The recruiter sounded polite, almost apologetic. "We usually don't discuss reference calls," the woman replied carefully. "But your parents were very concerned when we contacted them." The word parents hung in the air like a question that didn't belong there. Emily had not listed Robert or Linda Carter on any application. She hadn't even spoken to them in months. Her applications always included professional references, former professors, supervisors from internships, people who knew her work ethic and her character. The call ended a minute later with the same polite tone most rejection calls used, the kind that sounded kind on the surface but closed every door behind it. Emily set the phone on the table and stared at it. This was the 12th interview in 6 months. The 12th time everything had seemed perfect until the final stage. At first she had blamed the job market. Then she blamed her resume. She had rewritten it 3 times, adjusted every line, added volunteer work, even taken an online certification course in project management just to stand out. But something kept going wrong after the interviews, always after the background check or the reference stage. The pattern had begun quietly. A company that seemed enthusiastic suddenly stopped replying. Another employer who had spoken about a starting salary of $65,000 withdrew the offer without explanation. Each time, the silence arrived right after they said they would be verifying her references. Emily rubbed her hands together slowly, remembering the conversation she had just heard. Your parents were very concerned. The phrase didn't make sense. Robert Carter was a retired contractor who believed every young person should stay close to home. Linda Carter had spent most of Emily's childhood reminding her that the world was dangerous and unpredictable. 2 years earlier, when Emily packed her car and left for Denver, the argument at the front door had lasted almost an hour. Her father had said she was making a mistake. Her mother had asked why she wanted to abandon the family. But Emily had left anyway, determined to build a life that belonged to her. Since then the contact had been distant and polite. Holiday phone calls, occasional text messages about birthdays, nothing more. They certainly weren't part of her professional life. Emily stood up from the small desk and walked to the window, folding her arms against the chill coming through the glass. Somewhere below, a car door slammed and a dog barked in the distance. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood felt strangely disconnected from the thought forming in her mind. How had the recruiter even spoken to her parents? Emily never listed them anywhere. She opened her laptop and pulled up the application she had submitted 3 weeks earlier. The form was simple: education, employment history, professional references. No family contacts. No emergency numbers. Nothing that would point anyone toward Robert or Linda Carter. Yet somehow the company had called them. Emily stared at the screen, the quiet glow reflecting in her eyes. Slowly, almost unwillingly, a possibility began to take shape in her mind, one that felt too strange to say out loud. Because if the recruiter's words were accurate, then someone had not only found her parents' phone number, but had trusted what they said about her. And if that was true, then every rejection over the past 6 months might not have been a coincidence at all. Emily closed the laptop and stood in the silent apartment, the weight of the realization pressing down on her thoughts. For the first time since the job search began, she wasn't wondering what she had done wrong. She was wondering who had been speaking about her behind her back. Emily Carter barely slept that night. The small apartment remained quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a passing car outside. She lay awake on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the recruiter's words again and again in her mind. Your parents were very concerned when we contacted them. The sentence refused to fade. It sat in her thoughts like a splinter she could not remove. By morning, the pale light of sunrise crept through the thin curtains, washing the room in a dull gray glow. Emily sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She opened her laptop again and began reviewing every job application she had submitted over the last 6 months. One by one, she examined the forms carefully. Each application followed the same structure: education history, previous employment, professional references. None of them contained any contact information for her parents. Yet the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every rejection had arrived right after the companies verified her references. Emily leaned back slowly in her chair and rubbed her temples. She thought about the last 6 months of her life in careful detail. 12 interviews. 12 polite conversations with recruiters who had seemed impressed by her qualifications. Some of them had even talked about future projects she could work on. One hiring manager had spent almost 20 minutes discussing a potential salary package and relocation assistance. But then something changed. The tone shifted. Emails stopped. Offers disappeared. At first, Emily had blamed herself. She had rewritten her resume multiple times. She had practiced interview answers in front of a mirror until her voice sounded confident and calm. She had even purchased a professional background check on herself through an online service just to make sure there were no mistakes in her records. The report had arrived 2 days later. Clean. No criminal history. No legal issues. Nothing that could explain why companies suddenly lost interest in hiring her. Now the answer seemed to be standing right in front of her, and it made her stomach tighten with disbelief. Emily closed her eyes for a moment and pictured her parents' house in Colorado Springs. The wide driveway. The wooden porch swing her father built years ago. The house had always felt safe when she was growing up, but over time that safety had begun to feel like a cage. Robert Carter believed strongly in control and stability. He believed children should remain close to their parents even as adults. Linda Carter believed the world outside their small town was filled with risks that could ruin a person's life. When Emily announced she was moving to Denver 2 years earlier, the reaction had been immediate. Her father warned her that she was making a mistake. Her mother cried and asked why she wanted to leave the family behind. The conversation ended with an uncomfortable silence that lingered for months afterward. Since then, their relationship had remained distant but civil. Holiday phone calls lasted only a few minutes. Birthday messages arrived as short texts that said little more than happy birthday. Nothing in those exchanges suggested they were involved in her job search. Emily stared at the glowing laptop screen again and slowly opened the email from the recruiter one more time. She read the polite rejection carefully. The language was professional and calm, but one detail stood out clearly. "We appreciate your interest, but after reviewing additional information provided during reference verification, we will not be moving forward with your application." Emily felt a quiet chill settle in her chest. Additional information provided during reference verification. She looked around the small apartment again, as if the answer might be hiding somewhere in the room. The quiet space suddenly felt heavier than before. For months, she believed her struggle to find work was simply bad luck or a difficult job market. But now a different possibility had appeared, one that was far more disturbing than unemployment itself. Because if companies were truly speaking with her parents during reference checks, then someone had been telling them something about Emily that was not true. And if that was happening again and again, then the failures of the past 6 months were not accidents. They were the result of someone quietly rewriting her story every time she tried to build a new future. Emily Carter spent the next morning moving through her routine with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching someone else live her life from a distance. The sky above Denver was clear and bright, the kind of crisp Colorado morning that usually made the city feel full of possibility. But as she walked down the narrow sidewalk toward the neighborhood coffee shop, her mind kept circling the same unsettling thought. If companies had spoken to her parents during reference checks, then those conversations must have happened more than once. That meant the pattern was not random. It meant someone had repeated the same story about her again and again. Emily ordered a black coffee and sat at a small table near the window. She opened her laptop and began reviewing the timeline of her job search with careful attention. The first interview had been in October. A mid-sized marketing firm downtown had invited her for a second-round interview after she impressed the hiring manager with her portfolio. The meeting had gone well. They discussed responsibilities, benefits, and even the expected starting salary of $62,000 per year. 2 days later, the company emailed her with a short message thanking her for her time, but explaining they would be moving forward with another candidate. At the time, Emily assumed someone else simply had more experience. The second interview happened in November. This time it was a technology consulting company expanding its operations in Denver. The recruiter told her she had strong communication skills, and the team believed she would fit well with the culture of the company. The rejection came 4 days later. The third interview, the fourth, the fifth. Each opportunity seemed promising until the final step. Emily slowly realized something she had ignored before. Every company had mentioned contacting references right before the rejection arrived. She took a slow sip of coffee and stared at the screen. Her professional references had always been the same three people. Professor Alan Whitmore from the University of Colorado, her former internship supervisor, Karen Liu, and a volunteer coordinator named Mark Davidson who supervised the nonprofit where she spent weekends organizing community events. None of them had ever mentioned speaking with any employer recently. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. For a moment she hesitated. Then she scrolled through her contacts until she found Mark Davidson's name. Mark had always been direct and honest with her. If something unusual had happened during a reference check, he would probably tell her. The call connected after 2 rings. Mark greeted her warmly, asking how her job search was going. Emily explained she had another interview recently, but received a strange rejection. Then she asked the question that had been building in her mind all morning. Had any company contacted him recently about her references? Mark paused for a moment as if thinking carefully. Then he answered in a calm voice that immediately caught her attention. No company had called him in the past 2 months. Emily thanked him and ended the call slowly. Her hands rested on the table as the realization settled deeper into her thoughts. If the companies were not calling her listed references, then they must have been speaking with someone else. Someone who presented themselves as a reliable source of information about her. The memory of the recruiter's words returned again. Your parents were very concerned. Emily closed her laptop and looked out through the coffee shop window at the people passing along the sidewalk. Students with backpacks, office workers heading toward downtown, couples walking their dogs. Everyone seemed to be moving forward with their day. Meanwhile, a quiet and deeply unsettling question had begun to grow in Emily's mind. If her parents had somehow inserted themselves into her job applications, then how long had this been happening without her knowing? And more importantly, what exactly had they been telling people about her every time a company tried to hire her? Emily Carter remained seated in the coffee shop long after the last sip of coffee had gone cold. The quiet murmur of conversations around her blended with the low hum of espresso machines, but none of it reached her thoughts. The question turning in her mind refused to settle. If companies were not calling her listed references, then they were finding someone else to speak about her. Someone who sounded convincing enough that recruiters trusted their words. The memory of the recruiter's calm voice returned again. Your parents were very concerned when we contacted them. Emily leaned back slowly and folded her arms. The sentence had sounded casual at first, almost harmless, but now it felt like the center of something much larger. She opened her laptop again and searched for the email confirmation from her most recent interview. The company had been a mid-sized logistics firm expanding its operations in the western United States. The hiring manager seemed genuinely interested in her experience coordinating nonprofit events and managing volunteer schedules. During the final interview, he had even said something that stayed with her afterward. He told her they were looking for someone dependable, someone they could trust to organize complex projects. Emily remembered walking out of that office feeling hopeful for the first time in months. 2 days later, the rejection email arrived. She scrolled through the message again and noticed something she had overlooked earlier. The email signature included the name of the human resources representative who handled reference verification. Rachel Miller. Emily stared at the name for several seconds. A small part of her hesitated. Recruiters rarely discussed reference calls with applicants, especially after a rejection. But something about the past 6 months felt too strange to ignore now. Emily opened a new email window and began typing slowly, choosing her words carefully. She thanked Rachel Miller for the opportunity to interview and explained that she was trying to understand how to improve her job search. Then she asked a simple question. She wondered if there had been any concerns raised during the reference check process that she should address in the future. Emily reread the message 3 times before sending it. The request was polite and professional, the kind of follow-up many applicants wrote after interviews. Still, her finger paused over the keyboard before pressing the send button. Once the message disappeared from the screen, she closed the laptop and stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight. The wind carried the dry scent of early spring across the city streets. Emily walked slowly toward her apartment, her thoughts drifting back to Colorado Springs and the quiet house where she grew up. Robert Carter had always believed that loyalty to family came before everything else. Linda Carter often said the outside world could change people in ways they did not understand. At the time, those ideas sounded protective, even loving. But standing on the busy Denver sidewalk now, Emily began to wonder if those beliefs had another side she never fully recognized. By the time she reached her apartment building, the afternoon sun was already sliding lower across the sky. She climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor and unlocked the door to her small living room. The silence inside felt heavier than usual. Emily placed her laptop on the table and checked her email once more out of habit. There was nothing new yet. She sat quietly for a few minutes, listening to the distant traffic outside the window. Then the computer chimed softly. A new message appeared at the top of her inbox. The sender name was Rachel Miller. Emily felt her pulse tighten slightly. As she opened the email, the message was short and direct. Rachel explained that she normally could not discuss reference calls, but Emily's situation seemed unusual. She wrote that during the verification process, someone identifying themselves as Emily's parents had contacted the company directly and asked to speak with the hiring team. According to Rachel, they warned the company that Emily had a serious legal history and advised them to be cautious before offering her a position. Emily sat motionless as the words settled into place. The quiet room around her seemed to shrink for a moment as the truth finally began to take shape. The companies had not discovered her parents by accident. Robert and Linda Carter had been reaching out to them deliberately. Emily Carter remained seated at the small kitchen table long after reading Rachel Miller's message. The late afternoon light stretched across the apartment floor, casting long shadows against the plain white walls, but Emily barely noticed the time passing. The words in the email felt unreal, as if someone had described another person's life instead of her own. Someone identifying themselves as your parents contacted the company directly and warned us about a criminal history. Emily read the sentence again slowly, making sure she understood every word. Her hands rested quietly on the edge of the laptop as a heavy realization settled into place. For 6 months, she had believed she was simply struggling in a competitive job market. She blamed her resume, her interview skills, even her choice to move away from Colorado Springs. But now the pattern finally made sense. Each opportunity had not disappeared because she was unqualified. They disappeared because someone had quietly destroyed her reputation before she even had a chance to begin. Emily stood up and walked toward the window, staring down at the quiet street below her building. A delivery truck rolled slowly past and parked beside the curb while a man stepped out carrying 2 cardboard boxes. The ordinary rhythm of the city continued without noticing the shift happening inside her life. Her parents had been contacting employers directly, not once, but repeatedly. The thought felt impossible at first. Robert Carter had always spoken about honesty and responsibility. Linda Carter had always described herself as someone who only wanted to protect her daughter from harm. Yet the evidence now pointed in a completely different direction. Emily turned away from the window and returned to the table. Her laptop screen still displayed Rachel Miller's message. At the bottom of the email, Rachel had added one more sentence that Emily had not fully processed the first time she read it. Rachel explained that the company had been surprised by the call because Emily's application never listed family members as references. The parents had introduced themselves during the conversation and insisted the hiring team should be careful. Emily felt a quiet chill move through her chest. That meant her parents had been searching for the company she applied to. They must have been tracking her job applications somehow, finding the organization she contacted, and reaching out to them before any hiring decision could be made. Emily slowly sat down again and folded her hands together. She began thinking back through the past year, trying to understand when this might have started. 2 years earlier, she moved to Denver with a simple goal. She wanted independence. She wanted to build a career and create a life that did not revolve around the expectations of her parents. The decision had caused tension immediately. Her father believed she was abandoning the family. Her mother insisted that the world outside their hometown would eventually disappoint her. But Emily had believed the distance would eventually help their relationship settle into something calmer. She assumed time would soften their frustration. Now a different explanation was emerging. Instead of letting her build a life on her own terms, Robert and Linda Carter may have been quietly working to pull her back. If every employer heard the same warning about a criminal past that did not exist, then hiring her would seem like a risk no company wanted to take. The result would be exactly what her parents always predicted. Emily would fail in the city and eventually return home with no other options. The idea felt unsettling in its simplicity. Emily closed her laptop slowly and rested her hands on the table. For months, she had searched for mistakes in herself. Now the focus of that search had shifted completely. Because if Rachel Miller's message was accurate, then the obstacle standing in the way of Emily Carter's future was not a difficult job market or a weak resume. It was the quiet interference of the two people who once promised they only wanted what was best for her. Emily Carter sat quietly in the fading light of the evening, her hands folded together on the kitchen table as the weight of the discovery settled deeper into her thoughts. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of traffic moving through the streets of Denver below her window. For the first time since reading Rachel Miller's message, Emily allowed herself to think carefully about what the information truly meant. Her parents had not simply answered a phone call from a recruiter. They had actively contacted companies where she applied for work. That meant they had been watching her job search closely enough to know where to interfere. The realization raised a question that made her chest tighten with unease. How did they know where she was applying in the first place? Emily stood up slowly and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room where her laptop still rested. She opened the screen again and began reviewing the job search accounts she had been using over the past several months. LinkedIn, 2 professional networking platforms, several online job boards. Each one contained lists of companies she had applied to, along with dates and application confirmations. Emily scrolled through the information carefully, noticing something she had not considered before. Months earlier, when she first moved to Denver, her mother occasionally asked polite questions during their brief phone calls. Linda Carter would ask whether Emily had found work yet. She would ask which industries Emily was exploring. At the time, those questions sounded harmless, even supportive. Emily had answered casually, mentioning a few companies she was excited about and describing interviews she hoped would lead somewhere. She had not thought twice about sharing those details. Now the memory felt different. Each conversation might have given her parents exactly the information they needed. Emily closed her eyes for a moment as the pieces began to fit together. Her parents did not need access to her job accounts or private documents. They only needed to know the names of the companies she was contacting. Once they had that information, it would not be difficult to find public phone numbers or contact forms online. Emily sat back slowly in the chair as the quiet strategy became clearer in her mind. Every time she mentioned a promising interview, Robert and Linda Carter could simply search for the company and reach out before the hiring decision was finalized. A short conversation would be enough to create doubt. A warning about a legal history that did not exist would make any employer hesitate. Emily felt a deep sense of disbelief settle over her. The careful planning behind the interference was almost more disturbing than the act itself. Her parents had not confronted her directly. They had not argued or demanded that she move back home. Instead, they had quietly undermined her attempts to build independence, step by step, until every opportunity disappeared. Emily looked around the apartment again. The small living room contained only the essentials she could afford during months of temporary work. A simple couch, a narrow table, a bookshelf with a few college textbooks and notebooks from her internship days. Everything in the room represented the effort she had made to start her own life. For a moment, she wondered how many of those efforts had been quietly erased before she ever noticed. The silence of the apartment felt heavier now, filled with questions that did not have simple answers. Emily returned her attention to the laptop screen and opened Rachel Miller's email one more time. The message had revealed the truth about one company, but there were still 11 other interviews that ended the same way. If the pattern held true, then her parents might have contacted those employers as well. Emily rested her hands on the keyboard and considered her next step carefully. The discovery had answered one question, but it also revealed something even more important. If Robert and Linda Carter had been willing to interfere this deeply in her career, then there was no reason to assume they would stop on their own. Emily Carter understood now that uncovering the truth was only the beginning. The harder part would be deciding what to do once that truth could no longer be ignored. Emily Carter sat quietly at her kitchen table as night settled over the city, the faint glow of streetlights stretching through the apartment window and across the floor. The discovery she had made earlier that day refused to fade from her thoughts. For months, she had searched for answers inside herself, questioning every interview, every resume line, every decision she made after leaving Colorado Springs. Now the direction of those questions had shifted completely. The obstacle standing between her and a stable career was no longer a mystery. It had a source, and that source lived 2 hours south in the quiet suburban house where she grew up. Emily leaned back in the chair and stared at the dark screen of her laptop. The silence around her made every memory from the past 2 years feel sharper than before. She remembered the last long conversation she had with her parents before moving to Denver. Robert Carter stood in the driveway beside her packed car, arms crossed as he looked at the boxes in the trunk. He told her that the city would change her. Linda Carter stood on the porch steps with worried eyes and a trembling voice, asking whether Emily truly believed strangers in a large city would care about her the way family did. At the time, Emily believed those words came from concern. Now she wondered if they were warnings that independence would not be allowed so easily. Emily stood up slowly and walked across the room, pausing beside the narrow bookshelf where several old notebooks from college still sat untouched. She ran her fingers along the edges of the books, thinking about the years she spent working toward the life she wanted. Late nights studying, volunteer work on weekends, internships that paid little but taught her valuable skills. Every step had been part of a plan to create something stable and meaningful. Yet over the past 6 months that plan had quietly collapsed again and again. Emily returned to the table and opened her laptop once more. This time she began reviewing the list of companies she had interviewed with since October. There were 12 names in total. Some were small local businesses, while others were larger organizations with offices across the state. Emily studied the list carefully and began to imagine the same conversation repeating itself at each company. A concerned parent calling the office. A calm voice warning the hiring manager that their daughter had a troubling legal past. A suggestion that the company should be careful before offering her responsibility or trust. Even if the claim sounded uncertain, most employers would not take the risk. The hiring process would simply move on to another candidate. Emily exhaled slowly as the quiet strategy revealed its effectiveness. Her parents did not need to prove anything. They only needed to create doubt. She glanced again at Rachel Miller's message, remembering the tone of the email. Rachel had sounded confused by the situation, even sympathetic. That detail gave Emily a small but important realization. Not everyone believed the story her parents told. Some people had simply been cautious. Emily rested her hands on the keyboard as a new thought began to form. If the interference was happening repeatedly, then there might also be evidence of it. Emails, phone records, notes from recruiters who remembered the unusual call. The truth that had surfaced today was only the first piece of the puzzle. Emily Carter understood something clearly now that she had not understood before. The future she wanted would not simply appear through patience and hard work alone. Someone had been quietly rewriting her story behind closed doors. And if she wanted her life back, she would need to find a way to bring that hidden story into the open. Emily Carter remained awake long after midnight, sitting at the small kitchen table with the quiet glow of her laptop illuminating the room. Outside, the Denver streets had grown calm, the occasional car passing through the intersection below her building. But inside the apartment her mind continued moving through the same questions again and again. If her parents had interfered with one company, there was a strong chance they had done the same with others. The thought felt unsettling, yet it also carried a strange sense of clarity. For months, she had blamed herself for every failed opportunity. Now the failures had a different explanation, and that explanation could be investigated. Emily opened a blank document on her computer and slowly began writing down the names of every company she had interviewed with since October. One by one, the list grew across the screen. 12 organizations in total. Marketing agencies, consulting firms, logistics companies, and 2 nonprofit management groups. Each one represented a moment when Emily believed her career was finally about to begin. Each one had quietly disappeared after the reference verification stage. She studied the list carefully, noticing how hopeful she had been during each interview. She remembered the conference rooms, the polite conversations, the hiring managers describing the responsibilities she would take on. Those memories no longer felt like personal failures. Instead, they looked like opportunities that had been interrupted by something hidden behind the scenes. Emily leaned back in the chair and considered what she had learned. From Rachel Miller's email, the company had not discovered her parents by accident. Robert and Linda Carter had reached out directly, presenting themselves as concerned family members. They had introduced doubt before any hiring decision could be made. That detail meant something important. If they had contacted one company in that way, then they might have used the same approach with others. Emily returned her attention to the screen and added a new column beside each company name. In the column, she wrote the approximate date when the rejection arrived. The pattern was clear. Each rejection occurred shortly after the reference check stage of the hiring process. The timing lined up too perfectly to ignore. Emily felt a quiet determination begin to replace the confusion that had filled her thoughts for months. The truth she uncovered today did not erase the damage already done, but it offered something else. It offered direction. Instead of wondering endlessly why employers turned away, she could begin confirming what actually happened. Emily opened her email account again and searched through old messages from each interview. Several of the companies had sent polite follow-up notes similar to the one Rachel Miller wrote. A few even included the names of the recruiters who handled hiring decisions. Emily copied those names into her document as well. She understood that not every recruiter would respond if she asked questions. Hiring departments were often careful about discussing internal decisions. But Rachel Miller's willingness to answer suggested that at least some people might recognize how unusual the situation was. Emily glanced around the small apartment again. The modest furniture and quiet space reflected the long months she spent trying to hold her life together while searching for stable work. For the first time in weeks, however, the room did not feel like a place of defeat. It felt like the starting point of something different. Emily Carter closed the document and rested her hands on the keyboard as a clear thought settled into place. If the story her parents told employers had quietly blocked every opportunity she pursued, then the only way forward was to bring that story into the light where it could no longer hide behind private phone calls and quiet warnings. The truth had already begun to surface, and once a hidden pattern begins to reveal itself, it becomes much harder for anyone to pretend it never existed. Emily Carter woke just after sunrise with the quiet determination that had slowly formed during the previous night. The apartment was still dim with early morning light, the soft gray glow of dawn filtering through the thin curtains beside her bed. For a moment she lay still, listening to the distant sound of traffic beginning to move through the streets of Denver. The weight of everything she had discovered had not disappeared overnight, but the confusion that once surrounded it had changed into something clearer. She understood now that the pattern interfering with her career was real, and if it was real, it could be confirmed. Emily sat up and walked into the small kitchen, turning on the coffee maker while opening her laptop at the same time. The document she created the night before appeared on the screen, listing the 12 companies that had interviewed her during the past 6 months. Each name carried a memory of cautious hope followed by sudden disappointment. Now the list looked different. It looked like evidence waiting to be verified. Emily studied the first company on the list, a marketing firm located in downtown Denver. She remembered the interview clearly. The hiring manager had asked thoughtful questions about her project coordination experience and the volunteer work she organized for a community nonprofit. At the end of the meeting, he said something encouraging. He told her the team was looking for someone organized and reliable, someone who could grow with the company over time. Emily had left that office believing she finally found the opportunity she needed. 3 days later, the rejection arrived with no explanation. Emily clicked on the company website and searched for the recruiter's contact information. The name she wrote down months earlier appeared again in the hiring department section. She hesitated for a moment before opening a new email window. Her message followed the same careful tone she used with Rachel Miller. She thanked the recruiter for the interview and explained she was trying to understand how to improve her application process. Then she asked politely whether any concerns had been raised during reference verification that she should address in the future. The question was simple, professional, and respectful. After sending the email, she returned to the list and moved to the next company. The same process repeated. Each message carried the same calm wording. Emily did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing and did not mention her parents directly. Instead, she simply asked whether anything unusual had surfaced during the final hiring stage. The quiet strategy felt important. If several recruiters had received the same unexpected call from her parents, then at least one of them might remember it clearly. As the morning continued, Emily sent messages to 5 companies from the list. She knew not all of them would respond. Hiring teams often moved quickly from one candidate to another and rarely revisited past decisions. But Rachel Miller's reply had shown that at least some recruiters recognized how unusual the situation was. Emily closed the laptop after sending the final email and carried her coffee to the window. The sunlight had grown brighter, reflecting off the buildings across the street and filling the apartment with a warmer light than the night before. She stood quietly, watching people begin their morning routines on the sidewalk below. Office workers walked toward the bus stop, while a young couple jogged past with their dog. Life outside continued at its normal pace, unaware that Emily Carter had just begun uncovering something hidden behind months of quiet rejection. She took a slow sip of coffee and let the calm settle into her thoughts. The next answers might take time to arrive. Some recruiters might ignore the messages completely. Others might respond with polite but vague explanations. But if even one more person confirmed the same strange warning that Rachel Miller described, then the pattern would become impossible to deny. Emily Carter no longer felt like someone trapped by a mystery she could not understand. Instead, she felt like someone who had finally begun asking the right questions. The first reply arrived just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Emily Carter heard the soft notification sound from her laptop while she was washing a coffee mug in the kitchen sink. For a moment, she stood still with her hands in the warm water, listening to the quiet chime echo through the apartment. Her heart lifted slightly with a mixture of curiosity and nervous anticipation. She dried her hands on a towel and walked back to the small table where the laptop rested. The message came from the marketing firm she had interviewed with in October. Emily opened the email slowly, reading each line with careful attention. The recruiter thanked her for reaching out and said they appreciated her professionalism during the hiring process. The message then paused in a way that immediately caught Emily's attention. The recruiter explained that it was unusual to revisit past hiring decisions, but Emily's question about reference verification reminded them of something strange that happened during the evaluation stage. According to the message, a man identifying himself as Emily's father had contacted the office directly and asked to speak with someone on the hiring team. The recruiter wrote that the conversation felt unusual at the time because family members rarely contacted companies during the hiring process. The man sounded concerned and insisted he wanted to warn the company about a serious mistake they might be making. Emily felt the air leave her chest slowly as she continued reading. The recruiter explained that the man claimed Emily had experienced legal troubles in the past and suggested that hiring her could create problems for the organization. The message ended with a polite explanation that the company decided to continue evaluating other candidates after receiving that warning. Emily remained completely still as the words settled into place. The quiet suspicion she formed the night before had now been confirmed for a second time. Rachel Miller had described the same type of call. Now another company had received the same warning from someone identifying himself as Robert Carter. Emily leaned back slowly in the chair and stared at the screen. Outside the apartment window, the afternoon sun reflected off the buildings across the street, casting bright patterns of light into the room. Everything around her looked ordinary, yet the meaning behind the email felt enormous. The interference had not been a single moment of overprotective behavior. It was a pattern. Her father had repeated the same conversation with multiple employers. Emily opened the document she created earlier and added a short note beside the name of the marketing firm. Confirmed parent contact during hiring process. She paused for a moment before typing another detail. Warning about criminal history mentioned during call. Seeing the words written clearly on the page made the situation feel more real than ever before. Emily rested her hands quietly on the keyboard and allowed herself to breathe slowly. Months of confusion had finally begun transforming into evidence. One recruiter might have misunderstood a conversation, but two separate companies describing the same story could not be dismissed as coincidence. Emily glanced at the remaining names on the list of employers. There were still several companies she had contacted that had not responded to her emails yet. Some of them might ignore the message completely. Others might simply reply with polite phrases that revealed nothing. But now Emily understood that at least part of the hidden pattern had already been uncovered. Someone had deliberately stepped into her professional life and rewritten her reputation before she even entered the workplace. Emily Carter closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly. The truth was no longer a suspicion she carried alone in the quiet of her apartment. It was becoming a record that other people could see as well. And with every confirmation that arrived in her inbox, the quiet story her parents had been telling behind closed doors was beginning to lose its power to stay hidden. Emily Carter remained seated at the small kitchen table for several minutes after reading the recruiter's email, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen as the weight of the confirmation settled quietly into her thoughts. The afternoon sunlight had shifted across the apartment floor, now stretching toward the opposite wall, but Emily barely noticed the passing time. Two companies had now described the same strange situation. Two different recruiters had received nearly identical warnings from someone claiming to be her father. The pattern she suspected was no longer just a possibility. It was a fact. Emily opened the document she had been building and carefully added the new information beneath the marketing firm's name. Confirmed contact from parent, warning about legal history. She paused for a moment and reread the lines slowly. The words felt surreal even as she typed them. For months, she had believed her life in Denver was simply more difficult than she expected. She told herself that job markets were competitive and that new graduates often struggled before finding stable work. Now the truth looked very different. Emily leaned back in her chair and stared toward the apartment window where the afternoon sky had turned a pale shade of blue. She tried to remember the last time she had spoken to her father directly. It had been several weeks earlier during a short phone call that lasted less than 10 minutes. Robert Carter asked whether she had found steady employment yet. His voice had carried the same calm tone he always used when discussing responsibility and life decisions. At the time, Emily believed the question was simply a father checking on his daughter. Now she wondered if he had already known the answer. The thought made her chest feel tight with disbelief. Emily returned her attention to the laptop just as another email notification appeared near the top corner of the screen. The sender name was unfamiliar at first. Then she recognized the company listed beside it. It was a consulting firm she interviewed with in December. Her pulse quickened slightly as she opened the message. The recruiter thanked her for reaching out and explained that they remembered her interview clearly because she had impressed the hiring panel with her organizational experience. The message continued with a careful explanation. During the reference verification stage, the company received an unexpected phone call from a woman who introduced herself as Emily's mother. According to the recruiter, the woman sounded worried and insisted she felt obligated to warn the company about hiring her daughter. The recruiter wrote that the woman claimed Emily had experienced legal trouble and suggested the company should reconsider before moving forward. Emily read the email slowly, letting each sentence settle into place. A second recruiter had now confirmed that her parents contacted employers directly. This time it was not only her father. Linda Carter had made the call herself. Emily closed her eyes briefly and exhaled. The quiet room around her suddenly felt smaller than before. The strategy her parents used was becoming clearer with every response that arrived. They were not simply interfering once out of fear or emotion. They were repeating the same message again and again until every opportunity disappeared. Emily opened her document again and added another note beside the consulting firm's name. Parent contacted recruiter with warning about criminal history. As she typed the words, she realized something important. The evidence she was collecting was no longer limited to a single misunderstanding. 3 separate companies had now described the same unusual behavior. Emily rested her hands on the keyboard and looked at the growing list on the screen. Each confirmation added another piece to the quiet pattern that had shaped the last 6 months of her life. For the first time since moving to Denver, Emily Carter could see the full outline of the obstacle that had been standing in her way. All along, Emily Carter stared at the growing document on her laptop screen as evening settled slowly over the city. The quiet apartment was now illuminated only by the warm yellow light of the small lamp beside the kitchen table, and the soft glow from the computer screen reflected in her tired eyes. 3 companies had now confirmed the same disturbing pattern. 3 separate recruiters had received nearly identical phone calls from her parents warning them about a criminal history that did not exist. For months, Emily had believed her life in Denver was failing because she was not good enough or prepared enough for the professional world. Now the truth stood in front of her in simple, undeniable words. Someone had been rewriting her reputation behind closed doors. Emily leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the room surround her. Memories from the past 2 years began drifting through her mind. She remembered the excitement she felt when she first moved into this small apartment. The place was not large or luxurious. It had a narrow kitchen, a single bedroom, and windows that overlooked a quiet side street. But to Emily, it represented independence. It represented the beginning of a life she would build through her own choices and hard work. She remembered unpacking boxes, arranging her books on the small shelf, and imagining the career she hoped to create in the city. That hopeful version of herself felt distant now, almost like a different person entirely. Emily opened her eyes again and looked down at the document listing the companies she had contacted. 12 names. 12 opportunities that disappeared one after another. At the time, each rejection felt personal. Each email thanking her for the interview seemed to carry the quiet message that she simply was not the right candidate. Now she could see the story more clearly. Those decisions were never based on her qualifications alone. They were influenced by a warning that had nothing to do with truth. Emily slowly placed her hands back on the keyboard and added one more section beneath the list of companies. In careful words, she summarized what she had learned. Multiple employers received direct phone calls from Robert Carter or Linda Carter. The callers warned recruiters that Emily Carter had a criminal history and suggested companies should reconsider hiring her. Emily paused after typing the sentence and read it again slowly. Seeing the information written clearly made something inside her shift. For the first time she realized that what had happened was not just unfair or disappointing. It was deliberate interference in her professional life. Emily turned her head slightly and looked toward the dark window where the city lights shimmered faintly in the glass. Somewhere far beyond those lights was Colorado Springs and the quiet suburban house where she grew up. Her parents likely believed they were protecting her from the life she chose to build away from them. But the method they used had quietly damaged something far more important than a job search. It had damaged trust. Emily returned her attention to the laptop as another thought slowly formed in her mind. She now had written confirmation from multiple recruiters describing the same pattern of interference. That information changed everything about the situation she had been facing for the past 6 months. The problem was no longer invisible. It was documented. Emily Carter closed the document and sat quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of the discovery settle into place. For the first time since her job search began, the obstacles blocking her future no longer felt like a mystery she could not solve. In Denver had seemed to stall no matter how hard she worked. The problem had never been her abilities. The problem had been interference. Emily stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet street below her building. The city lights reflected faintly on the pavement while a distant bus moved slowly down the avenue. Somewhere far south of the city was Colorado Springs, and beyond that quiet suburban neighborhood was the house where Robert and Linda Carter were probably finishing their evening routine, without any idea that the story they had been telling behind the scenes was beginning to surface. Emily rested her hands on the windowsill and allowed herself to think about something she had avoided all day. Eventually, she would have to speak with them. The thought felt heavy. Confronting strangers about a misunderstanding was one thing. Confronting your own parents about deliberate interference in your life was something very different. Emily returned to the table and looked again at the document on the laptop screen. The evidence was still limited, but it was growing. 3 companies had already described the same unusual phone calls. There were still several recruiters who had not replied yet. If even one more response confirmed the same story, the pattern would become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Emily closed the document and opened her email inbox again, scanning the messages carefully. There were no new replies yet, but the quiet pause did not discourage her the way it might have a week earlier. Now she understood that the answers would arrive gradually. Some recruiters might take time to respond. Others might never reply at all. But the truth had already begun to reveal itself piece by piece. Emily glanced around the small apartment once more. The narrow bookshelf, the simple couch, the table where she had spent months sending applications and preparing for interviews. Everything in the room represented the effort she had made to build a life that belonged to her. For the first time since moving to Denver, she no longer felt like someone waiting for permission to succeed. Instead, she felt like someone who had finally uncovered the reason her progress had been blocked. Emily Carter slowly closed the laptop and placed both hands flat on the table. The quiet determination inside her thoughts had become stronger than the confusion she felt before. The next step would not be easy. Speaking with her parents about what they had done would force a conversation they had avoided for years. But Emily understood something clearly now. Silence had allowed the interference to continue for months without challenge. If she wanted her future to move forward, that silence could not continue forever. And sooner or later, the truth she had uncovered inside this quiet apartment would need to be spoken out loud. Emily Carter woke the next morning with a quiet but steady resolve that had been forming inside her thoughts since the night before. The early sunlight filtered softly through the apartment window, casting pale golden lines across the kitchen table where her laptop still rested. For several seconds, she simply stood there, listening to the calm rhythm of the city beginning another day. Cars moved slowly along the street below, and somewhere in the distance a bus engine hummed as it passed through an intersection. The ordinary sounds of the morning felt strangely grounding after the heavy realizations of the previous day. Emily brewed a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the table again, opening the laptop to review the document she had created. The list of companies and the notes beneath each one now looked less like scattered observations and more like the outline of a story that had been quietly unfolding behind her back. 3 separate recruiters had confirmed that her parents contacted them with warnings about a criminal history that did not exist. The pattern was clear enough that it no longer felt like speculation. Emily stared at the screen for a moment before opening her email inbox again. During the night, another message had arrived from one of the companies she contacted earlier. Her pulse tightened slightly as she clicked the message open. The recruiter introduced himself politely and explained that he remembered her interview because she had demonstrated strong organizational skills and a thoughtful approach to project management. The message continued with a careful explanation that mirrored the others she had already received. During the hiring process, someone identifying himself as Emily's father had reached out to the company directly. The man said he felt obligated to warn the organization that his daughter had experienced legal problems in the past and that employing her might create complications. The recruiter admitted the situation had seemed unusual but concerning enough that the company decided to move forward with another candidate. Emily read the email twice before leaning back slowly in her chair. A fourth confirmation now existed. The pattern had repeated itself again in nearly identical language. Her parents had not made a single emotional phone call out of worry or panic. They had deliberately repeated the same story to multiple employers across several months. Emily opened her document again and carefully added the new confirmation beneath the consulting firm entry. She wrote the recruiter's name and summarized the message in clear words. Another direct call from parent warning about criminal history. As she typed the line, she noticed something that had not occurred to her before. The wording described by each recruiter sounded almost rehearsed. The same concern, the same warning, the same suggestion that hiring her might be risky. It felt less like spontaneous worry and more like a prepared message that could be repeated whenever needed. Emily rested her hands quietly on the keyboard as the significance of that detail settled into place. Her parents had not simply reacted to her leaving home. They had created a consistent narrative designed to stop her progress in the professional world. The realization felt heavy, but also clarifying. Emily looked again toward the window where the morning sunlight had grown brighter across the quiet street. The future she imagined when she moved to Denver had been delayed, but it had not disappeared completely. Now that the interference was becoming visible, the path forward was slowly revealing itself. And with every new confirmation that arrived in her inbox, the story her parents had been telling in secret was becoming harder and harder for anyone to ignore. Emily Carter sat quietly at the kitchen table as the morning light filled the small apartment. the laptop screen glowing softly in front of her while the list of confirmations continued to grow. For different companies had now described nearly the same conversation with her parents, each recruiter explaining how a concerned mother or father had contacted the company to warn them about a criminal history that did not exist. Emily stared at the document for several seconds, absorbing what that number truly meant. For companies out of 12 had already confirmed the interference. That meant 1/3 of the opportunities she had pursued over the past 6 months had been directly affected by the same story. The realization felt heavy but strangely clarifying at the same time. For months, she had wondered whether she was simply unlucky in a difficult job market. Now she could see that the situation had been shaped by something far more deliberate. Emily leaned back in her chair and folded her arms, thinking carefully about the conversations she used to have with her parents after moving to Denver. Linda Carter often asked casual questions during their short phone calls. She would ask whether Emily had interviewed anywhere interesting recently. She would ask what companies Emily hoped to work for. At the time, those questions seemed harmless, almost supportive. Emily would answer without hesitation, mentioning company names and describing interviews she felt excited about. Now those memories carried a very different meaning. Each conversation may have given her parents the information they needed to locate those companies online and reach out before a hiring decision was finalized. Emily turned her attention back to the laptop and slowly scrolled through the document again. Beneath each company name, she had written a brief summary of what the recruiters explained. The pattern was impossible to miss. Concerned parent call. Warning about legal history. Suggestion that hiring Emily could be risky. Each message followed the same structure, almost like a script that had been repeated over and over again. Emily rested her hands quietly on the keyboard and considered what this meant for the months ahead. The interference had been hidden because it happened behind closed doors through private conversations that she never witnessed. Employers simply chose another candidate and moved on. But now those hidden conversations were beginning to surface as written confirmation from the recruiters themselves. The story that had quietly followed her from interview to interview was no longer invisible. Emily glanced toward the window where the sunlight reflected brightly across the buildings on the opposite side of the street. The city outside continued moving at its normal pace while inside the apartment something important had shifted. She no longer felt like someone chasing opportunities that disappeared for reasons she could not understand. Instead, she felt like someone who had uncovered the mechanism that kept closing those doors. Emily returned her attention to the laptop just as another email notification appeared in the corner of the screen. For a moment, she simply watched the small message icon appear, her heartbeat quickening slightly. With anticipation, another recruiter had responded. She opened the message carefully and began reading. The recruiter explained that the company did remember a strange phone call from someone claiming to be Emily's father. The man sounded calm but insistent, warning that his daughter had a troubling background and suggesting the company should reconsider hiring her. Emily exhaled slowly as the familiar description appeared once again. The fifth confirmation now existed. She added the new note beneath the company name, watching as the pattern became even clearer across the document. What had once been a quiet suspicion was now a record supported by multiple voices. Emily Carter looked at the growing list and understood something with absolute certainty. The story her parents had been telling behind the scenes had shaped nearly every opportunity she pursued in the city. But now that story was no longer hidden. And once the truth begins appearing in writing, it becomes much harder for anyone to pretend it never existed.